In a world carved by sorrow, where a man's face wore the deep lines of loss and a young girl's eyes had lost their light, an unspoken pact was formed. He was a farmer who'd buried his heart with his family. She was a girl sold into silence, with nothing left to lose. He bought her simply to work his land, never imagining that her silence would be his undoing. His name was Eli, and the land he owned was a perfect mirror of his soul. Weeds choked the empty fields. The barn sagged, heavy with neglect, and at the center of it all stood the blackened skeleton of his farmhouse, a constant reminder of the fire that took his wife and son 2 years before. He'd built a small, severe cabin for himself, but his life was still in those ashes. Grief had hollowed him out, and all he had left was work. It was this grim, empty need that drove him to town, not for comfort, but for a pair of hands to help him wrestle a living from the dead soil. The auction was a theater of human misery. The air was thick with sweat, fear, and desperation. A brutal marketplace where people were handled like livestock, their worth measured in muscle and teeth. Families were torn apart with the casual bang of a gavel. Eli stood at the back, his face a mask of granite. He was there for one reason, a simple transaction. Or so he told himself. Then he saw her. She was young, maybe 17, standing on the block. While others cried or glared with defiance, she was just still. Her gaze was fixed on something far beyond the jeering crowd, her expression so vacant it was as if her spirit had already fled. The auctioneer called her Clara, but the name didn't seem to stick. He pointed out her youth, hinting at uses beyond fieldwork, a vile but common practice. Still, the bidders were hesitant. They saw her stillness not as quiet obedience, but as a sign of being broken, of a stubbornness that couldn't be beaten out. To Eli, that brokenness was exactly what he wanted. A shattered spirit wouldn't fight or cry. It wouldn't remind him of the life and laughter that once filled his home. She would be a silent, functional tool. The bidding was low. With a curt nod, the deal was done. He had bought a girl whose emptiness seemed to match his own. He led her away from the block, her bare feet trailing in the dust, and neither of them spoke a single word. The journey back to the farm was just as silent. When they arrived, Eli pointed to a small, clean cot in the corner of the barn. He laid out the rules in clipped, functional sentences. Work starts at sunrise, ends at sunset. Meals on the porch. Clara just nodded, her eyes never quite meeting his. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if trying to conserve every last ounce of energy. The days bled into weeks, each one a copy of the last. Eli would rise before the sun, eager to lose himself in the back-breaking labor that quieted his thoughts. But he'd always find Clara already there, tending the chickens or mending a fence with a quiet competence that was both efficient and unnerving. She did everything she was told, never complaining, never hesitating. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was a wall. A fortress she'd built around herself, where nothing and no one could ever reach her. Eli had wanted quiet, but this silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, listening silence that filled all the empty spaces his grief had carved out. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch and watch her by the barn, a still silhouette against the fading light. He started studying her, trying to read the blank map of her face. He'd bought her to be a ghost, but her silence was louder than any scream. It was the sound of a resilience he couldn't understand, and it was starting to chip away at the stone around his heart. The change came with the fury of a sudden thunderstorm. A bruised purple sky unleashed a torrent of wind and rain that lashed the farm. Eli was in the old barn trying to secure a loose section of the roof when a rotten support beam finally gave way. It crashed down, pinning his leg. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him. He was trapped, helpless in the raging storm. He figured he might lie there for hours, maybe even days. But then a figure emerged from the downpour. It was Clara. She took in the scene without a word, her eyes showing no panic, only sharp, focused assessment. She grabbed a long, sturdy plank, wedged it under the beam, and with a strength that seemed impossible for her small frame, used it as a lever. The beam lifted just enough for Eli to drag his mangled leg free. He lay there, gasping in the mud and rain, looking up at her. He tried to thank her, but the words were rusted from disuse and caught in his throat. He only managed a choked sound. Clara simply nodded, her expression unchanged, and disappeared to fetch bandages. Later, as she silently and efficiently cleaned and bound his wound, he saw her for the first time, not as a possession, but as a person who acted with a clarity he'd lost long ago. The wall around his grief had been breached, not by a flood of emotion, but by a single, silent act of care. A few weeks later, while his leg was still healing, Eli noticed something else. Clara had started working a small, scorched patch of earth beside the ruins of his old house. It was where his wife, Ilara, had kept her garden, a place he hadn't been able to even look at for 2 years. He watched from a distance, a knot of anger and resentment tightening in his chest. It felt like she was trespassing on sacred ground. He wanted to scream at her to stop, to leave the ghosts alone, but he couldn't. Day after day, he watched her clear the charred debris and pull the stubborn weeds. In her spare moments, after the long day's work was done, she'd turn the soil with tender hands. Soon, tiny green shoots began to appear. First wildflowers, then rows of beans and squash. This small explosion of life was a defiant splash of color against the gray canvas of his farm. And his heart. One evening, an impulse he didn't understand sent Eli to the old shed. He found a small, dusty tin box. Inside was a packet of seeds, Alara's favorite poppies. He walked to the edge of the new garden and placed the packet on a tree stump. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The next morning, he saw that the seeds had been planted right in the center of the plot. It was their first real conversation, a silent treaty between two wounded people, signed with the promise of a flower. As the seasons turned, the garden flourished. So did the farm. For Eli, work was no longer a frantic escape from memory. It was a shared rhythm, a quiet partnership. The silence between them changed too. It was no longer an empty void, but a comfortable space filled with understanding. They spoke in small gestures. He'd leave a polished apple or a warmer shawl for her on the porch. She'd leave a bundle of fresh vegetables or a single poppy by his door. He began to see the deep scars of her past not as proof that she was broken, but as the source of her incredible, quiet strength. He realized that for 2 years, he had been tending his grief like a prized crop, watering it with bitterness. Clara, in her silence, had shown him another way. She didn't ignore the scorched earth. She planted a garden on it. In her resilience, he finally found the permission to start healing himself. The heart he thought he'd buried was slowly, tentatively, beginning to beat again. Their fragile peace was shattered one afternoon by the arrival of a cruel-eyed neighbor, a man who'd been at the auction. He saw the recovering farm, the flourishing garden, and Clara working nearby. No longer with a vacant stare, but with a quiet dignity. "Well, I'll be. You got the mute one working after all," the man sneered, his eyes lingering on Clara. "Still haven't gotten a word out of her. Some stock is just too damaged to fix." Something inside Eli that had been dormant for years finally ignited. A protective fire roared to life in his chest. "She has a name," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's Clara, and this is her home. You will leave, now." Stunned by Eli's ferocity, the neighbor stammered and retreated. The confrontation left Eli shaking, not with anger, but with a powerful realization. He hadn't defended his property. He had defended his family. The law might say she belonged to him, but his heart knew the truth. In every way that mattered, they belonged to each other. That night, for the first time, he didn't sit on the porch alone. He brought a stool and sat near her, by the warmth of a small fire. He looked at the woman who had silently pulled him from the wreckage of his life, and he began to speak. He told her about Clara and his boy Sam. He said their names aloud for the first time in 2 years, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with the gentle sadness of a loving memory. When he finished, the silence that returned was different, full and warm with shared humanity. After a long moment, she looked at him, her eyes clear, and whispered a single word, her voice raspy from disuse. "Clara." He had gone to the market to buy a pair of hands, a simple tool to work his desolate land. Instead, he found a partner in his own healing. Clara, a girl who was sold into silence, found not a master, but a safe harbor where she could finally reclaim her name and her spirit. The farm, once a monument to sorrow, became a testament to their shared journey. That burned patch of ground, once a symbol of everything he'd lost, was now a vibrant garden, living proof that even from the deepest ashes, new life and a new family could find a way to grow. If this story of resilience and healing moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of the human spirit. What part of Eli and Clara's journey stayed with you? Let us know in the comments below.